Welcome to the Secure Connections podcast, brought to you by IOTA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. I'm Brian Sherman, Content Director for IOTA, and your host for today's session, as always. On today's episode, I'll be discussing cybersecurity innovation with our friend Gill Langston, Head Security Nerd at Solarwinds MSP. Welcome back to the Secure Connections podcast, Gill.
Thanks for having me, Brian. I'm excited to be here.
Well, good. We're always happy to have you stop by and talk about all things cybersecurity and COVID related, and hopefully we'll stop talking about the latter and more of the former as we move the rest of the way through 2020. But either way,
fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. It's great to have you back. So, but I'm going to start off with the latter. So, after 4 months of COVID-19, how has the pandemic changed work life at SolarWinds?
Well, we're all still at a optional stay at home. We do have some offices that have given you the option to come in. And of course, they've implemented all the cleaning procedures and the things that need to be done. But the majority of us are still working remotely. And, right now, we're just kind of making sure that we focus on staying connected and in contact. We do a lot of really fun things on our Teams chat and things like that to keep everybody engaged and in communication. So it's kind of just moving forward, getting it done.
Very cool. So what things do you miss most from a personal perspective during the pandemic?
Well, I could tell you, I generally have been working from home or working remotely even before the pandemic. So, I had some generally being accustomed to that. But one of the things I do miss is because I'm working at home, being able to go out and just do things on a whim is my leaving work, if you will. So now I'm kind of always at work. So, there are those, hey, let's run down to X or this store. Things have to be planned out more. You have to make sure you have your mask. You have to make sure it's not going to be too busy, right? So, really just kind of being in the house all the time, I guess is my biggest thing, pet peeve, if you will. I also do miss haircuts. I'm kind of opting out of that one. I know our haircut place has opened up recently, but I'm trying to avoid as much contact as possible and only go out to, critical or necessary things. So, I miss being able to go out and just quick random conversations with people, I think, that I bump into. What about you?
Yeah, no, I did indulge and did get a haircut because, you don't want to see me when my hair gets long. I'll just leave it at that point. But yeah, no, I see your point too. Is carrying around, for my mask and my hand sanitizer has become the norm for me, especially my office downtown to walk around. But yeah, you have to think about things a little more often. But I do a lot of stuff rural, outdoors, so that part doesn't bother me. But I think during the summer, what I'm really going to miss is going to a movie. I really do enjoy going to a movie during the summertime when it's a hot day, and that's going to be a little bit weird. We even had a local one filmed this year, so we're looking forward to seeing it, but we'll have to wait until fall or next year.
Well, either that or set up a nice little home theater because they're streaming a lot of stuff now, but it's not the same. It's not the experience. And
it's not the new big Hollywood release, There's a Top Gun, man. I want Top Gun. It's summertime.
Exactly.
No, that's all good. That's all good. So, hey, let's shift to they're all serious topics, but let's shift to today's topic: innovation in the cybersecurity realm. And this is an area where you're very experienced. We love talking about it. It's been always a big discussion point with all the events that we do too. Is what's the latest and greatest, especially from a channel perspective, because cybersecurity is a differentiator, and the more they know, the more options they have, more recurring revenue streams they have, but more importantly, keeping the SMB protected. Why is it so important to keep an ear to the ground these days for MSPs when they see new solutions hit the market?
Well, generally, there's a cycle. There's always a cycle with these things, right? Yeah, some new solution comes out. It's a niche product. It then goes into that acceptance phase and adoption phase, and then it's normalized. And generally, when it comes to especially service providers, they kind of have their core solution and they're good at it and they know it and they understand it. So the idea of bringing in some new solution into a stack or switching something out for a newer version isn't necessarily top of mind, right? But yeah, then you have this situation like recently. I use the pandemic as an example, right? The move to home. Everybody started thinking, "Oh, wow, do I have the resources and do I have the right security solutions and the right stack in place to be able to support people at home?" We've talked at length about that, right, on multiple casts and discussions that we've had. So then suddenly they're scrambling, right? You're on Reddit, you're looking at what other people are doing, you're going into forums and peer groups, and what are you guys doing? And you're getting all of these different answers. If you're staying on top of what's out there and available a little bit more often, even if you're not looking to move immediately, I think it shortens that curve, right? That scramble to say, how am I going to give somebody secure access from their own system at home on their own network outside of all of my network protections, and how am I going to do that quickly? I think even keeping your ear to the ground about those, just in general, taking a little bit of time weekly, or finding the right places to go to find those solutions, will shorten that response time that you have. But also, it helps you when you look at new solutions. You also start to understand how the threat landscape is changing, because let's face it, a new solution generally is released or put out into the market to solve a more current problem. So it helps you understand how the threat landscape's evolving as well, and what kind of risks you could be facing.
Yeah, and that's to that point too, is for MSPs are looked at as thought leaders, and with all the uncertainty, this is definitely an area where MSPs can stand up and can be the consultants, and have probably been so more than ever before in their history, as far as working directly with the end users even more now too, because in a distributed environment, you've got many endpoints, many specific issues. Look at even Zoom. I mean, going back 2.5 months ago, nobody discussed security issues with Zoom and Zoom bombing. And think where we've come in like the last 3 months now, to where we're now transitioning to where, work from home might be, more permanent than we thought before.
Well, and with the news you hear recently, that's becoming more and more of a possibility. I mean, there are some states that are saying they might have to go back into a lockdown or a stay-at-home order. You see a lot in the news about organizations saying, we're going to continue the work from home thing kind of indefinitely. So, being ready for those types of things means understanding what solutions are out there, and to your point, the risks and the benefits of each one, and weighing those, and then saying, I'm going to put this in my stack. But something interesting you said, while MSPs are looked at to be the thought leader, right? You're my IT guy, you're my security guy. I would argue, though, that there's a few kind of barriers to investigating and adopting new technology, right? First one I talked about, you're busy. You want to make sure that you do understand your stack, and it's a very clean kind of, organized setup. And this is what we deploy. It's in my playbook. Here are my responses that I have to those. So between being busy and having that experience, I'd say sometimes that is really a barrier, but the other barrier is the customer, right? So staying in contact with them, and here's something I hear a lot, just to go down that road. A lot of MSPs say, man, I can only introduce like one new solution a year at most to my customers, because they simply won't accept the amount of change, and I have to renegotiate contracts and, all the things that come with that. But I would say the business model in a lot of those situations really kind of dictates how easy that is to swap out a newer solution or some new innovation, right? If everything is kind of a list of items, and each thing is its own line item on your bill, sure. But if you have that all in per device, per user, it becomes a lot easier to swap out some solution. Say, example I always give is EDR. It's a great kind of example of how a technology that was niche at one time, and only for those threat hunters and those security specialists, and then it moved into mainstream. So if you have a business model that supports it, it's a lot easier, right? It takes away that barrier. You can just say, hey, we're switching to EDR from, whatever endpoint antivirus we were using. We're going to be making that swap, but your bill doesn't change. But a lot of MSPs I talked to said, hey, I took a look at the amount of time it takes me to respond to even 1 or 2 incidents in a month. And if I have something like EDR that has rollback and is looking at more different types of threats, then I'm going to save money there. So I'm just going to absorb that cost difference, keep my costs the same. I don't have to renegotiate contracts, but now I have something that protects better. It's innovative. It's more cutting edge. So it really depends on how you look at your entire business, I would say.
So if you're looking at cost neutral, not necessarily that the price of the other solution you're swapping out is the same, but maybe look at the time that's involved for your tech team to respond to issues and others. So take a holistic look at the costs of swapping out as opposed to just piece for piece.
Right. Cost is not just a margin exercise against the per device that you're paying to a vendor, right? It's all the things that are around it, ease of management, how much time I have to spend working with that, and how much time that I might have to spend responding to an issue. So, I would say that's how you really have to balance that cost benefit ratio.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what big shifts are you seeing in cybersecurity solutions? Let's talk about the specific examples of technologies now that MSP should be really focusing on.
I'd say there's 2 or 3. I kind of talked about EDR and how that went away from the new and emerging into kind of mainstream. It's something that's in a lot of people's toolboxes. But the kind of techniques and tactics and procedures that the bad actors are using, they don't necessarily change. The delivery mechanism may change, right? For a long time, it was, you had your antivirus, your endpoint tools. People kind of, you created a piece of malware, it performed all these actions, it did it all almost automatically, if you will. Everything was coded in and it acted. Well, a lot of those were starting to get blocked. They were getting lower and lower success rates. And so they almost shifted back to the old hacker mentality of, well, sure, I'm going to use some tools, but I'm also going to use some tactics. And that means actually getting remote access and manually doing things, elevating privilege and then moving across the network and executing scripts and doing some manual kind of work, which might not necessarily be picked up by traditional endpoint protection. So a lot of the solutions you're seeing now are going back to, honestly, to me, these are core principles you should have always been on the lookout for within a network if you're really doing some evaluation of your network. But they're automating the detection and elevation of those things using threat intelligence, using the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right, to say these are bad actions. So you're seeing more solutions that are becoming more easy to use, easy to manage, based on those things rather than the manual work it used to take. So while there aren't a lot of tons of, like this is a new thing in security because we're still protecting against the same stuff, it's a new way of doing it. So, you're seeing a lot of moving back to the endpoint, where for a long time everything was network and then it became back to endpoint again, right? You're seeing a lot of that because of remote workers, because of cloud resources. So you are seeing a lot of that shift, and that kind of goes into the zero trust mindset, right? So zero trust was a concept, and then it became, more of a way of thinking and a way of operating, which is where we are now. So with zero trust, you ended up with things like cloud-based firewalls, right? Let's go ahead and start protecting where people are. They're on the internet. They're not in a network within 4 walls. The applications are on the internet, they're in the cloud. So let's go ahead and put that where we're going to be detecting. So that whole zero trust idea, it's just a mindset, really. Our vice president of security likes to give a lot of talks about security, Tim. And my favorite kind of analogy he makes is before it was an avocado, right? There's this big center, and that's your network and your data and your people inside a building. But now you have to look at zero trust more like a pomegranate, right? There are all these little seeds, and each seed is an application and a data set and an entity and people. So now you have to look at protecting those individual components inside it. So having cloud-based firewalls that do conditional access depending on where somebody's coming from, who they are, what device they're using. Those are all kind of important things to be focusing on now. So that's more of a framework than it is a solution, but there are tons of solutions that have popped up around that help support that zero trust mentality.
Now you talked about zero trust. Well, let me go back. First of all, like with the pomegranate, it's a great example, except those seeds can be a lot more toxic
Yes,
than an actual.
True.
Yeah, if you've got a bad environment or a bad individual you can't control.
that's
Um,
true.
but going back to zero trust, is your point is it's a mindset. Can you kind of dive into that a little more? Is how should MSPs approach zero trust with their clients or explain zero trust to them? Not that they
Sure.
have to, but the concept.
Well, take a look at the old way of doing things, right? You had a network, and when people were on the network, they could connect to all these shares, and things were available, and you could, sure, you could log in, but it was pretty much assumed that anybody who was inside that network is someone who's supposed to be there. This day and age, they really say you should go from assuming breach, assuming somebody has gotten into your network somewhere, and you need to protect it from them even when they're inside the network. So that's kind of one piece of it, right? That means asking people to authenticate to each individual resource that they're trying to get to, making sure that that you're using some two-factor authentication when they are accessing those. Sure, you can make it easier, and we'll probably talk about that in a minute. But there are a couple of things to kind of ease that requirement. But then also, when you're outside the network, make sure that somebody's on a device they're supposed to be using, right, rather than some other random device. In the old way, what would you do? You'd give them VPN access to the network and then have at it. But now a lot of those applications aren't even in that network anymore, right? They're in other places. So you don't have that layer of protection to say, okay, authenticate to the network, and now you have access. So just really, I would say it's all about making sure the right people are accessing the right data from the right systems. I think that's the easiest way to kind of communicate what zero trust really means. And, that's the why. And the what is, well, sure, cloud applications, two-factor authentication, conditional access, depending on where you are. Those are the whats that you would do to make sure that you accomplish those goals.
So it's pretty much assuming the worst case scenarios are potential or are happening at that point, and putting every possible protection measure in place to keep the data and information and people secure.
Well, a lot of people, that to your point, a lot of people these days, when they're doing internal penetration tests, they actually start from a compromised machine, right? That is actually where they start. They don't say, well, I'm going to try to find a way in. Some people do that. There's external penetration testing, and the idea is, let me see how far in I can get.
Right.
But a lot of people who do some of this consulting say, no, just give me a machine that I have some log into, even if it's low level, because the reason is you need to assume that someone can get that access very easily. So that's that whole assumed compromise point.
So it's like
right?
Scary Movie. He's in the house, right? He's in the
All
house.
coming from inside the house, right?
Coming from inside the house.
It's just too easy these days for somebody to get access to a system, and then that system comes back into the network and calls home. So, I think that's a valid way to say is, people probably are already in the network, or at least have found a way in and looked around to see if they found anything interesting. The question is, how hard did you make it for them to then take the next step, to elevate, to get access to another account? Because as most people in security say, the more expensive you make it for an attacker to continue his actions, the more likely it is for him to give up somewhere along the way. If you can just guess a password, or you can steal a password from some previous breach where the guy used his corporate email and a password that he's still using internally, it's very easy for you to get access to a system. But then if the next thing you try to get to challenges you with two-factor, it becomes harder and harder to continue on in your kind of journey of breaching the network.
That's a good question too. I guess going back to when you look at phishing training and cybersecurity training for end users these days, does it take that into account? I haven't done it more recently, to be honest. I use one computer. But have you had much experience with those? Are they taking that like insider or zero trust approach, or are they still looking at it from external?
Well, most of the awareness training, sure, they do talk about proper behaviors, but most of the awareness training is more about keeping the users informed about what type of attacks that they could experience, what to be on the lookout for, what to do when you do accidentally fall for something and realize it's fake. But it's about processes, it's about behaviors, and it's about recognizing those. But to me, all of them, sure, they teach you individual things, but it's more about just having that mistrusting mind at everything that comes your way, right? Trust but verify kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, the mindset. So what important things should IT service providers be focusing on when researching new cybersecurity options for their business, for their clients?
Well, I would say mapping it back to what we just talked about, right? It's making sure, how is this going to protect? Number one is identity, right? It's always about identity, identity, identity. It always has been to some extent, but with this proliferation of applications and that spread of applications out to the cloud and to different locations and the people being remote, it's a lot easier to gain access to those. So whatever it is, make sure that when you're looking at a solution, that it does give you a mechanism to protect any identities that are created. That could mean something as simple as saying, hey, we're going to do password manager, right? Most MSPs are already using some form of password manager or vault or something within their organization to protect customer credentials, right? Hopefully. But then extending that same protection to the customers that you support and saying, hey, I'm going to make you log in to this, this password vault, the password manager, two-factor authentication or multi-factor in some way. And then when you're accessing some of your other solutions, you can have more complex passwords. You don't have to write them down or store them somewhere because they're stored for you. They're submitted securely to the site. Those kind of things. At least, that's one example is, are you protecting the identity? How are you protecting the data? Who else can have access to this data? Have I considered how I segment access to that data to the people who only need it? One example I give you there is recently with a lot of our solutions here at Solarwinds, we're kind of moving down this forcing multi-factor authentication. For a long time, we've offered it, and then we started saying, hey, Mr. Administrator, here are all the accounts that don't have it enabled. You should probably do this. To now saying, if you have privileged access in this system, you have to configure your multi-factor authentication. That way we know that people are protecting those credentials and they're protected against someone getting their credentials and just getting access. So make sure that identity is being protected in any new solution that you're taking a look at for sure.
Is that still, and I hear that from the MSP communities, it's still a struggle to get certain clients, certain users within clients to follow the protocols when it comes to, implementing multi-factor authentication, especially for those, well, it should be for all applications that they're utilizing, but what are you seeing as far as success on your policy? Sounds like you're pushing towards requirement. It has to have this. What are some of the other, is that the route that MSPs have to take? And what do they do when they get pushback from clients?
So I talk to a lot of MSPs, and some of them do just that. They say, I'm sorry, this is part of my core offering. We have to protect your credentials. They are your crown jewels. And you need to understand how your users treat credentials. It's not good. They write them down, they put them in spreadsheets that is very easy to discover. They reuse, I've said this, I think on a previous podcast, they reuse that same password from the LinkedIn breach. It's the same one. They just know it and they use it. So making sure they understand those. A lot of MSPs do enforce it. There are some that go the route of, I want to do a dark web scan or show you how many of your credentials are out there. Pardon me. Sorry about that. They instead try to convince, right? But you're always I always like to say no plan ever survives engagement with the enemy, right? The old battle plan argument. You're going to have somebody who says this is just too hard or this is inconvenient and I don't want to do it. So at that point, I think then you have to have a risk discussion with your customer and say, this is a level of risk you're signing up for that I'm not sure that I'm interested in. We've talked about this at previous events and things, that the risk register, the hold harmless letter, I don't know how effective those are in a lot of situations, but I would say you may want to consider someone who's not willing to take on multi-factor authentication as an extreme risk to your business.
Yeah, and I've actually heard two attorneys that specialize in IT service industry talking about the legality of those too. Is
Right.
asking them to opt out doesn't opt you out as an
No.
MSP. You're still responsible for their data protection, and if they don't follow the rules, you're just as gullible as they are. And I can see that point from when it comes to the law. Yeah, there's not much leverage on your side.
No,
So
well, there are a lot of things that are like that. In a lot of
yeah,
states, non-competes aren't enforceable because, you have to work. In this case, I would argue, to your point, you ask a small business or a business owner who uses an MSP, how do you handle your security? They say, I've got a guy for that, right? And that guy's you, and they're going to say you didn't take your best efforts to keep us protected if there's a breach. And let me tell you, once a breach happens and you start having to shut offices down for extended periods of time and recover, and people are angry, then the fingers start pointing.
Yeah. So this is one area, and that's what I'm hearing more often than not, that you need to stick to your guns. This is a requirement, a baseline requirement, two-factor authentication, password management. Let's talk about password management, because that's where a lot of times, to your point with the dark web, is people are still using the one they used in high school. Well, if they're younger anyway.
Right.
I don't know that I had a
If they had a password in high school.
Yeah, I don't think I did. We didn't even have a terminal at that point. Yeah, I'm dating
Yeah.
myself, but yeah, I mean, managing it there's a lot of solutions for managing passwords now. You got SolarWinds has a very good option, but let's talk about the management part. Is that should be a standard? It would seem like with any client today too.
Yeah, at the bare minimum, if you're not using one of these full SSO providers that are out there, that do full integration, at least having a password manager is at least going to allow you to protect all of those credentials and then make it easier, right? So the number one thing, in our head of community engagement, Colin, which I know has been on before, loves to talk about this. It's all about user experience, right? You stand to get better adoption of any process, any procedure, any new thing, if you make it as easy as possible for your end users, right? Making it hard, pushback. Making it easy, acceptance. So, being able to make it very easy, and, Passportal has plugins for the browsers, and, it even within our RMM, allows the credentials for take control for remote access to be auto put in there if you log in. So, making it easier does increase the adoption. And if you're using something like Okta and those things, they usually work with stuff like Duo that allows you to have a push notification, and then once you log in, you have access to all your apps. So making sure that you have a focus on making it easier from the beginning. It's very hard to go back in and say, okay, we're going to try this again, but with something that makes it easier once you've gotten the pushback.
Yeah.
Right.
Credential management is pretty much like having the key or the driver's license these days. You get the privilege to being able to access the roads. In this case, it's access the internet for businesses. It's trying to
Yeah,
keep it simple.
absolutely. That's kind of the way you have to approach it, and make sure you're partnering, right? So you need that business owner or the stakeholder on your side in that conversation.
Yeah.
You need to explain those risks, give them some examples from news articles, things like that, where it was one set of credentials that started this.
Yeah.
Or even talk about how a lot of attacks are moving back to brute force remote desktop versus some complex plan. They just literally find a system and they start banging on credentials till they find some. So those types of things, making sure they understand the risks that are out there, communicating in a way that they go, okay, what do we do about this? Here are our solutions, right? Here's what we're going to do. And then helping them, getting them as a partner to deliver that news to the user base. And here's what we're doing moving forward. Here are your instruction sets, making it easy for them to adopt is the key.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that's sometimes the biggest reluctance is getting the business owner, the business managers to buy into that. And once they understand that, once they've been hacked, know somebody who's been hacked, had to deal with it themselves, it becomes a much bigger issue. Unfortunately, that seems to be the only way to overcome the objection with some small business owners. But
I was going to say that's easy. That's the softball, right? If they say I've been breached or my buddy just lost his business because he was breached, that's the softball, right? It's it's making sure that the ones who haven't had a breach yet understand that if you look at statistics, it's just a matter of time till there is. I'm not saying I'm not saying every breach is a business ending type of event.
Sure.
But I mean, what level of risk are you willing to take? Or do you sleep well at night knowing that people are probably on your systems today?
Yeah.
Right. So, that's the conversation to have.
Especially if they're already paying for many of these things. They're just too lazy, or I won't say ignorant, but too obstinate to actually implement them across their organization. And that's where I think a lot of MSPs are banging their heads, is it's not rocket science, and they hope their clients would get this. But
Well, if you've had a client for a few years, though, there is that other challenge. You know that client, and you know how they're going to answer, and sometimes that can prevent you from having the conversation. Right?
True.
It's you're like, I know how this guy's going
I
to.
don't want to have, yeah.
Sometimes putting, and this is something we talk about a lot, putting that conversation into your regular business conversations that you have with them. Let's take a minute to talk about security, how we're doing, how the environment is doing, how the threat landscape is. Spend a few minutes on that. Even if it's every 6 months, you have a conversation, once a month, once a quarter. Add that security review to the conversation so that it is constantly being discussed.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how is SolarWinds helping its partners? We're talking about innovation today. How are you helping your partners innovate their portfolios?
Well, so, if you've kind of been keeping an eye on SolarWinds, we recently started a relationship last year with SentinelOne. Now we're integrating their EDR solution into our RMM platforms. We are focusing on, as we said, authentication, making sure that multi-factor is being enforced. You're going to see more and more of that across our existing solutions. So, that's really where we're really focused on the security aspect of being a managed service provider. And we're going to continue to create the ability for other vendors in the future to be able to create integrations, that kind of thing. We're working on an ecosystem to where we'll be able to integrate other solutions. That's pretty early on, but that is something that we have in the works.
So is it all about, being able to share real-time information, being able to notify people of potential issues? What's the advantage, I guess, to take a step back of, the platform, the ecosystem, and the integrations?
Well, yeah, it's first, the number one thing for a managed service provider, they always say, are clicks is currency, right? The more things you have to jump around to, the more time that you spend just finding out what's going on. So bringing those all into kind of one place at least gives you that, I hate to say single pane of glass, but the idea is.
I was actually going to do that for you, but it's okay.
Yeah,
you took that.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But it does give you the ability to kind of have all the solutions in one place you go, but you do get advantages. A great example with SentinelOne, when you install an agent, we actually create monitoring services automatically that will monitor the health and status of the agents. We also auto update them, right? So we take a look and say if they're behind, we're going to go ahead and update those. So we keep them updated automatically. So those are the kind of things that we talk about when we say integrations, right? It's the little things. Whereas in the SentinelOne console, you actually have to go in and say, please update. We're going to go ahead and do that for you because that's just something that we know that staying up to date in security is absolutely critical. So we just do that for you.
Yeah. So being able to have everything in one place makes it easier for MSPs, but also more importantly, easier to manage and to overview. Right. That makes sense. So, Gill, any final thoughts before we end today? Our time is, as always, is never long enough. But what are you thinking before we head out?
I am thankful in some ways that there were a lot of predictions at the beginning of this move to work from home that it was going to be Armageddon on the side of small medium businesses and threats and all of that. I'm glad to hear that it wasn't quite as bad as expected. I mean, of course, there are always threats, and they didn't really change. The topics changed, right, to get people to click. But I'm glad to see that it wasn't as bad as expected. However, we're going to continue to be in this phase for a while, and I think you are going to see more and more bad actors take advantage of that. So just make sure that you're keeping an eye on those people who are newly at home, and that you're constantly considering that situation when you're looking at new solutions.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point too. I think if anything, it's been a challenge for the channel, for the community, but it's also, I think, the shining point of everything they've been doing over the years, guess what? Most of it worked, especially when the clients were actively involved. But
I agree.
yeah, I mean, I heard less issues. Most of the comments I heard back from MSPs over the last 3 months is, it's amazing we had this set up, and it really hasn't affected us a lot because we already had our clients enabled with this. And when
Right.
you hear MSPs talking about this, it's like, yeah, this is a no-brainer. We're adjusting some things, but I'm not having the headaches. And that's, I think, that really pays off to show that they've done the homework, they've done the legwork. And, for if you have a good client base to work with, it's so much less headaches.
Absolutely. So our GM said on our last partner meeting, and it's my favorite statement, you were built for this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So
I agree. Well, that's a great point to leave with. And a big thank you to today's special guest on Secure Connections podcast, Gill Langston, head security nerd at Solarwinds. Always glad to have you stop by. Be sure, for those that are listening, to stop back Wednesdays for other great channel cybersecurity discussions, and be sure to check out all the MSP focused resources at iotza.com. Have a safe and secure day on behalf of the IOTSA team. And Gil, thank you.
take care, everyone.